It's 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning, September 23rd, 1986. Glenda Frost is at home when her phone rings. She answers, and the woman on the other end sounds exactly like her friend, Vivienne Cameron. They chat for several minutes about sewing patterns, about a retirement present for a co-worker, specific details, inside information about workplace dynamics, normal friendly conversation, the kind they've had dozens of times before. Except, according to the official timeline, Vivienne Cameron has been dead for 5 hours. Her body should be at the bottom of Bass Strait, carried out by brutal currents after jumping from the San Remo Bridge before dawn. The police are at Beth Barnard's farmhouse processing a murder scene. Investigators are beginning to piece together what they believe happened. That Vivienne killed Beth in a jealous rage, then drove to the bridge and jumped. And yet, here's Glenda Frost, having a perfectly ordinary conversation with someone who sounds exactly like a dead friend, discussing details that only Vivienne would know. Struth. When the dead call you on the telephone, when the official timeline says one thing and a witness swears to another, when a case that seemed closed suddenly has a hole so big you could drive a truck through it. In part 1, we walk through the night of September 22nd, 1986, when Beth Barnard was brutally murdered and Vivienne Cameron vanished. We saw how the immediate evidence seemed to point clearly at Vivienne. Her cigarettes at the crime scene, her blood type on the path, her belongings in the abandoned Land Cruiser near the bridge. Murder-suicide, crime of passion. An easy one for detectives. But when forensic scientists looked more carefully at that evidence, when they started asking not just what was there, but what should have been there, the story begins to fall apart. Welcome to part 2, where we examine what the evidence really shows, and where we ask the question that's haunted this case for 40 years. What really happened to Vivienne Cameron? There are 2 types of evidence that help us to understand what really happened that night on Phillip Island. The first type is referred to as mobile evidence, items that can be transported, planted, arranged to tell a particular story. For example, cigarettes can be smoked in one place and the butts can be deposited easily somewhere else. Towels can be soaked with blood and moved. Personal belongings can be gathered and placed in a vehicle. Blood can even be collected on fabric and transferred. All of these things can be moved from one location to another by anyone who wants to create the impression of someone's presence. Another type of evidence that we need to consider in this case is transfer evidence. These are the minute traces left by actual physical contact between 2 people. For example, when you're in a violent struggle with someone, physics takes over. Fabric fibres transfer from clothing to skin, hair gets pulled out, skin cells get scraped off under fingernails during defensive scratching. If both people in the scuffle are bleeding, their blood mixes where wounds touch. This type of evidence is created by the mechanics of violent contact. It can't be easily faked. It certainly can't be planted after the fact. It's either there because the contact actually happened, or it's absent because it didn't. At Beth Barnard's murder scene, every piece of evidence pointing to Vivienne Cameron was mobile. and every piece of transfer evidence that should have been there if Vivienne had really committed this murder was completely absent. Recall the distinct pink mohair jumper that Vivienne was seen wearing when the hospital nurse saw her at 11 p.m. on the night of September 22nd. Mohair is amongst the most distinctive fabrics in forensic investigation. It comes from Angora goats, and its fibres are long, soft, and incredibly prone to shedding. If you've ever been lucky enough to own a mohair sweater, you know exactly what this means. You wear it once and suddenly there are mohair fibres on other clothes, on your furniture, on other people who've hugged you. The fibres cling to everything. They transfer with remarkable ease, highly visible under microscopic examination, especially if they're pink. So in forensic terms, mohair is a gift to investigators. It leaves traces everywhere the wearer goes, and those traces are easy to identify and impossible to mistake for anything else. So let's think about the crime scene at Beth's farmhouse. Beth was attacked in her bed. The killer was close enough to stab her repeatedly, close enough to slash her throat so deeply the blade scraped bone, close enough to carefully carve the letter A into her chest with multiple deliberate cuts. This wasn't an attack from a distance. This was intimate violence, delivered at arm's length with the killer leaning over the victim in her bed. Beth fought back. The defensive wounds on her hands proved that. She struggled. She tried to push the attacker away. She grabbed at them. She fought for her life. In that kind of close-quarter struggle, with the victim clawing and fighting, the attacker's clothing would be in constant contact with the victim's body, with the bedding, with everything in the immediate area. If someone wearing a pink mohair jumper had committed this attack, that bedroom would have been filled with pink mohair fibres. They'd be on Beth's body where the killer leaned over her. They'd be on her nightgown where she grabbed at the attacker. They'd be in her bedding from the struggle. They'd be under her fingernails where she fought back. They'd be scattered across every surface the killer touched or brushed against. But forensic investigators found no pink mohair fibres at Beth Barnard's farmhouse. Not in her body, not in the bed, not under her fingernails. Not anywhere in that house. Not a single one. This is easy to explain away, of course. Maybe sometime between 11 o'clock when she was at the hospital and 3 a.m. when the timeline suggests Vivienne was headed to Beth Barnard's to commit the murder, she could have got rid of the jumper. It is important to note that that pink mohair jumper was never found by anyone, anywhere. But for the sake of the argument, let's say it did disappear and she didn't wear it at the crime scene. The mohair jumper wasn't the only impossible absence. There was something even far more damning missing from the Land Cruiser found abandoned near the bridge. What happened to Beth Barnard creates massive bleeding. This wasn't a single quick stab and retreat. This was sustained, frenzied violence. The killer stood over her, stabbing repeatedly, and then stayed long enough to carefully carve the letter A into her chest. Multiple cuts, deliberate precision in the midst of blood and gore. The crime scene photographs show blood soaked into the bedding, blood spatter on the walls, blood throughout the bedroom. It was a profoundly bloody murder, and the killer would have been covered in that blood. Not a few specks, not a bit on the hands, absolutely covered. Now imagine that same person drenched in the victim's blood getting into a vehicle. They've got to open the door, bloody hands on the door handle. They have to slide into the driver's seat, blood-soaked clothing pressing against the fabric. They have to grip the steering wheel with blood-covered hands, touch the gear shift, work the pedals, turn the key in the ignition. Every surface they contact should transfer blood. Forensic investigators have techniques that can detect even tiny specks of blood, amounts invisible to the naked eye. They can find blood that's been wiped away, blood that someone tried to clean up, microscopic traces that would escape normal observation. They tested that Land Cruiser with these techniques. swabbing every surface where blood might transfer. They found no blood from Beth Barnard anywhere in that vehicle. Not in the steering wheel, not in the seats, not in the door handles, not in the gear shift, not the pedals. Not on any surface that the killer would have had to touch to drive from the murder scene to the bridge. And this is compounded by the fact that there's no real obvious explanation as to why Vivienne would have taken the time to clean that blood if it was her that committed the murder. If she is on her way to commit suicide, why on earth would she stop and take the time to clean blood in such a methodical and meticulous way that forensic experts could find no trace of it? That just doesn't make sense. So if it was Vivienne that moved that Land Cruiser, the forensic science would suggest that she didn't have any trace of Beth Barnard's blood on her. And if it wasn't Vivienne who moved the Land Cruiser, then who was it? There was also a complete absence of all other transfer evidence that should have been present from a violent close quarters attack. When Beth fought back, and we know she fought back from the defensive wounds on her hands, she would have been grabbing at her attacker, scratching and trying to push the knife away. That kind of defensive fighting almost always results in the attacker's DNA ending up under the victim's fingernails. Skin cells get scraped off. Sometimes hair gets pulled out. It's one of the most reliable sources of perpetrator DNA in violent attacks. And in knife violence, it's incredibly common for the attacker to cut their hand and for their blood to end up on the victim. But forensic investigators found no attacker DNA under Beth's fingernails. Despite her obvious struggle, despite her defensive wounds proving she fought back, there was no DNA from whoever killed her beneath her nails. They also found no DNA from Vivienne on or around Beth's body at all. No skin cells, no hair, no saliva, certainly no blood. Nothing that would indicate Vivienne had been in physical contact with Beth during the attack. In a close quarters knife attack where the killer is within touching distance, where their hands are gripping and struggling, the attacker's DNA should be present somewhere. The only blood on Beth's body was her own. Despite the ferocity of the attack, despite the multiple wounds, there were no mixed blood samples. This would suggest that Beth had been completely overpowered by her attacker. Beth Barnard, a young farmhand fighting desperately for her life, was well and truly overcome. Furthermore, we know that Vivienne had been injured earlier at some point at the Cameron house. Their blood should have mixed at some point during the contact. Criminologist Catherine Whiteley, who studied the case years later, observed something else about the nature of the violence itself. The strength required to inflict those wounds. The pattern of the attack. The sheer physical force involved in slashing someone's throat that deeply. In stabbing with enough force to penetrate flesh and muscle repeatedly. In her professional assessment, she was looking at a very masculine male killing as opposed to a female killing. The knife found near Beth's body seemed like it should be crucial evidence, a murder weapon recovered from the scene. But when forensic scientists examined it in detail, they began expressing doubts. The blade didn't quite match the pattern of wounds on Beth's body. When they compared the cuts to the knife's dimensions and edge characteristics, things didn't align the way they should if this knife had made those specific wounds. There appeared to be double cuts in Beth's clothing, places where the fabric showed two parallel slashes. That seemed inconsistent with this particular blade's edge and width. The scientists couldn't definitively rule it out as the murder weapon, but they also couldn't confirm it was. And that ambiguity itself was troubling. If this was the actual knife used to kill Beth and carve the letter into her chest, the wound should match it precisely. and the knife had no fingerprints on it at all. The handle was completely clean, which could mean gloves were worn, or the knife was wiped afterward, or the knife was planted and had been cleaned before being placed at the scene. The towel in Beth's bathroom raised similar questions. It had type A blood on it, Vivienne's blood type, but it had no blood from Beth. If someone had used that towel to clean up after murdering Beth, to wipe blood off their own hands after cutting her throat and stabbing her, that towel should be saturated with the victim's blood. Impossible to separate. Instead, it only showed blood matching Vivienne's type. Blood that could have been collected from the Cameron house that was covered in Vivienne's blood and transported to Beth's. So let's return back to the phone call at 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning at the top of the show. Glenda Frost, sitting at home with a friend present, receiving a call from someone who sounded to her exactly like Vivienne Cameron. Not similar, not maybe Vivienne, exactly like her. They talked for several minutes. The conversation wasn't vague or general, it was specific. They discussed particular sewing patterns for an ongoing project. They made plans for a retirement present for a specific co-worker. The caller knew details about workplace dynamics, about ongoing projects, about the kind of inside information that only someone intimately familiar with Vivienne's daily life would know. Glenda's friend was present during the call. She heard Glenda's side of the conversations and she could corroborate that phone call occurred. That Glenda spoke with someone for several minutes about these specific topics. This wasn't later imagination or false memory constructed in grief. It was witnessed and verifiable. In addition, the friend was from out of town. She was visiting Glenda on a very specific date, which makes this even trickier to put down as just misremembering the time or date of the call. The presence of Glenda's friend in the room helped her to identify exactly when the call was received. But according to the official timeline that was later established by the coroner, Vivienne Cameron had been dead for approximately 5 hours when that call was made. She'd supposedly murdered Beth around 3:30 that morning, driven to the San Remo Bridge by 5 a.m, and jumped into the channel before dawn broke over the water. Interestingly, the coroner's official findings in July 1988 make no mention of this phone call. It was simply excluded from the timeline, set aside as impossible because it contradicted the official theory. But Glenda Frost has never wavered in her certainty. Years later, decades later, she would still insist I spoke with Vivienne Cameron at 10 o'clock on the morning of September 23rd, 1986. If Glenda was right, if she really did speak to Vivienne 5 hours after Vivienne supposedly jumped from the bridge, then the entire official narrative collapses. Either Vivienne didn't jump from the bridge at all, or she jumped much later than the timeline suggests, hours after the baker had first seen the Toyota Land Cruiser parked by the bridge. Or the person who called Glenda was an impersonator so skilled and knowledgeable that they could discuss specific workplace details and ongoing projects in Vivienne's voice. And let's revisit the magical handbag that moved. Remember Robin Dixon arriving at the Cameron house at 3 a.m. to babysit the children? She specifically observed Vivienne's black handbag sitting by the back door. It wasn't a vague memory, it was a specific detail that stuck with her because it seemed odd. If Vivienne had left to take Fergus to the hospital as she claimed to Robin Dixon was happening, why would she leave her handbag behind? At 4 p.m. the same day, when Pamela Cameron discovered the abandoned Land Cruiser near the San Remo Bridge, that same black handbag was inside the vehicle. The handbag was at the Cameron house at 3 a.m. It was in the Land Cruiser by 4 p.m, which means that someone went back to the Cameron house during those 13 hours, collected that handbag and placed it in the abandoned vehicle. This isn't speculation. This is documented observation from an independent witness with no stake in protecting anyone. The handbag moved. Someone moved it deliberately. Someone who understood that the scene at the bridge needed to show Vivienne had left with her personal belongings. Very much like someone was staging evidence. While we're on that for a second, isn't it interesting that with all of that police presence, people going backwards and forwards across that bridge all day, that it was a member of the Cameron family that actually discovered the abandoned Land Cruiser? It was only later that the baker recalled seeing it there much, much earlier that day. And just to confuse things even further, I'm going to throw in one more detail. One more bit of evidence that didn't emerge until years later, but adds another layer of mystery to the timeline. In 1994, a witness came forward with a statement about something they'd seen in the early morning hours of September 23, 1986. At around 5:30 a.m, just after the Land Cruiser had been spotted parked by the baker near the San Remo Bridge, this witness observed something unusual. An agricultural motorcycle travelling without lights, heading from the New Haven direction back toward the Cameron Farm area. The rider was wearing an oilskin coat, moving through the pre-dawn darkness on a vehicle that wouldn't attract the attention a car would, using farm tracks and back roads. Agricultural motorcycles, of course, were common on Phillip Island. Every farm had them for moving around properties, checking on stock, getting to places where cars couldn't easily go. But travelling without lights at 5:30 in the morning, coming from the direction of the bridge, heading back toward the Cameron property, that was unusual enough for the witness to remember it 8 years later. The official timeline has Vivienne jumping from the bridge around 5 a.m. So who was riding that motorcycle at 5:30? Where were they coming from? Where were they going? And why was this observation never adequately investigated or explained? It's another piece that doesn't fit the simple narrative of Vivienne acting alone in jealous rage. As police investigators tried to piece together what happened that night, they encountered something that would hamper the investigation from the beginning. Deliberate, organised silence. Journalist Vicky Petrides, who began researching this case in the early 1990s for a book, The Phillip Island Murder, encountered this wall of silence firsthand. She was warned off writing the book, told directly by multiple people that she shouldn't leave this story alone. When she persisted, trying to interview people who'd been on the island in 1986, many refused to speak with her at all. Others would agree to interviews if they could meet off the island, away from Phillip Island, away from watching eyes and listening ears. And even decades later, Petrides has observed something that chills her. Seems like people were scared to speak about it. Not reluctant, not protective of privacy, scared. When a book was finally published in 1993, Phillip Island bookstores refused to stock it. News agencies wouldn't sell newspapers that featured excerpts. The island had made a collective decision that this story should not be told. I'm just going to take a moment here to recommend Vicky Petrides' book about this case. It is my all-time favourite Australian true crime book, so make sure you look it up. I'll put a link in the show notes. And if you can't get a copy, she's also made a tremendous podcast about this case. Again, links in the show notes. The Cameron family wasn't just wealthy. They were island royalty. Founding shareholders in the Grand Prix circuit, major landowners for generations. Challenging them meant challenging the island's entire power structure, with consequences that could ripple through every aspect of your life. So people stayed quiet. They created a wall of silence that investigators couldn't penetrate. In July 1988, nearly 2 years after that violent night, Victorian coroner B.J. Maher delivered his official findings. Without Vivienne Cameron's body, without physical proof of her death, without resolving the contradictions in the evidence, without explaining the forensic impossibilities, he concluded that Vivienne Cameron was dead, that she had leapt from the San Remo Bridge, that she had contributed to the cause of her own death. The findings meant no one could ever be charged with Beth Barnard's murder. The prime suspect had been declared dead, making prosecution impossible. As I mentioned, the coroner's findings made no mention of Glenda Frost's phone call. They didn't address the absence of transfer evidence. They didn't explain the mohair fibres that should have been there. They didn't account for the questionable murder weapon. And they didn't resolve the blood evidence contradictions. They didn't explain why a devoted mother would abandon her sons. And they didn't address the handbag that moved magically between locations. The official story was locked in. Murder-suicide. Case closed. But closing the case officially didn't make the questions go away. In 2006, Sensing Murder investigated the case. During production, a private investigator uncovered evidence significant enough that it remains legally suppressed to this day. What did they find? We still don't know. In 2020, the Case Files Presents podcast series was downloaded more than 8 million times. In 2021, Under Investigation brought it back to television. And Victoria Police never actually stopped investigating. As recently as September 2020, cold case detectives were still actively working the case. And that brings us back to Thursday, January the 15th, 2026. The bones in the sand on Hazelwood Court. Human remains that could have been there for up to 40 years. Victoria Police established a crime scene. DNA analysis, dental record comparisons. The forensic testing continues. As of this recording, no identification has been confirmed. The fundamental questions of this case remain. If Vivienne killed Beth, how did she do it without leaving fibres? How did she avoid leaving DNA during a violent struggle? How did she get no victim's blood in the escape vehicle? If she jumped at 5 a.m, who called Glenda at 10 a.m? Who moved the handbag? Who was riding that motorcycle at 5:30? Why was there blood at the Camerons' house if Vivienne showed no injuries at the hospital? Why did the entire community close ranks? And most fundamentally, what really happened to Vivienne Cameron? But even if you're not a fan of the official conclusion laid down by the coroner, even if you think that the Camerons had something to do with this, there are still unanswered questions on that side of the fence as well. Who called Glenda at 10 a.m? Why did they make that call? What possible purpose would that have served? If Vivienne Cameron had already been killed and her body buried by that time, why would they complicate matters by calling Glenda at 10 a.m? when all of the other evidence suggests that someone was trying their best to make suicide from the bridge look like the most obvious theory? The only logical reason that you would call Glenda at 10 a.m. pretending to be Vivienne is if you wanted to make it seem like she was completely unaware that Beth had been murdered, that she had no clue what happened on the island the night before, that she was too busy thinking about sewing patterns and goodbye presents for colleagues, and that after that she just vanished. That makes no sense either. September 2026 will mark 40 years since that violent night. 40 years of questions, 40 years of silence. The official story requires us to believe a series of impossibilities: that a devoted mother abandoned her sons, that she committed murder without leaving transfer evidence, that she drove away without getting victims' blood in the vehicle, that her body vanished in waters that should have returned it. Each impossibility on its own might have an explanation, but all of them together, it just stretches credibility past breaking. What we do know is that Beth Barnard was murdered. She was just 23 and she died in absolute terror, and that justice for her was never served. We know that Vivienne Cameron has completely disappeared. Her sons have grown up without answers. Her family have lived with the official story branding her a murderer without ever having the chance to defend herself. Maybe, hopefully, the bones found earlier this year will finally tell us the truth. Maybe DNA will speak when witnesses refused. Or maybe the questions will only deepen. Struth. Thanks for listening to another episode of Struth, a two-parter about the death of Beth Barnard and the disappearance of Vivienne Cameron. I know there's been a lot to take in, but there was a heap of evidence to uncover and a heap of things to analyse to try to get to the bottom of it. I would really love to hear your theories and thoughts on this one. It's a case that's always fascinated and puzzled and disturbed me. So please, in the comments wherever you get your podcast, let me know what you think happened on that fateful night. Thanks again for listening to the show, and thanks for sharing it with a friend. I'll catch you next week for another episode of Struth.